She didn't choose solitude because she wanted to be alone. She chose it because she finally realized being surrounded didn't mean being seen. Being loved didn't mean being understood. Being wanted didn't mean being met. She had given so much, softened so much, held space for so many who never once asked, "What do you need?" So one day, quietly, she stopped explaining, not out of spite, but out of exhaustion. She stopped chasing connection, stopped over-explaining her heart, stopped trying to be the version of herself that made others feel comfortable. And in that silence, something happened. Not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. She didn't leave people. She returned to herself. Carl Jung once said, "Loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important." And maybe that's what finally broke her. The long ache of speaking without ever being heard. Now, when you see her alone, don't mistake it for emptiness. She is full of herself now, in the most sacred way. And by the end of this video, you'll understand what that fullness really means. Why some women walk away not because they stopped loving you, but because they finally stopped abandoning themselves. If this speaks to something in you, subscribe, leave a comment, let yourself be heard here, because this space isn't about noise. It's about truth and the quiet power of choosing yourself. Number 1, the woman who walks away and doesn't look back. It wasn't sudden. You just didn't notice the moment she left, because it didn't look like leaving. It looked like smiling with less effort, laughing less loudly, pausing a second longer before replying. It looked like softness turning into stillness, like her body being present, but her soul already gone. She had been unraveling quietly, thread by thread. And every time you ignored her tension, every time she swallowed her own truth to keep the peace, something inside her loosened. She didn't want to leave. She wanted to stay, but not like that. Not as someone who had to suppress herself to be chosen. Not as someone who had to explain her worth just to be held. She tried. God, she tried. Not just with you, but with life. With every version of love that asked her to bend just a little more. And for a while, she did. Until one day, her silence stopped being a survival mechanism and became a sanctuary. Jung spoke of thresholds, moments in the psyche where the ego collapses and the soul reclaims authority. That's what happened to her. She stopped waiting for someone to validate her pain, stopped asking for someone to see what she had buried to keep love alive. And when she stopped asking, she started remembering. She remembered the girl she used to be before she was taught to confuse love with self-abandonment. She remembered her laughter, her rage, her wildness, and she realized she didn't lose herself. She had just been giving herself away in pieces. So when she finally left, she didn't do it with resentment. She did it with reverence for the woman she had forgotten and for the woman she was still becoming. She didn't look back, not because she was H, but because that turning around always meant losing herself again. And this time, she chose to stay with herself. Number 2, she doesn't hate men. She's just tired of betraying herself. People often assume that when a woman walks away, she must be angry, that she must have given up on love, that she's closing herself off. But the truth is softer and much heavier. She didn't leave because she hates men. She left because she grew tired of abandoning herself in their presence. Not because they were cruel. Some were kind. Some made promises they believed in. But even then, she found herself shrinking, playing smaller, making room for their emotions while ignoring her own, clinging to connection even when her soul felt starved. She had been told, over and over again, that love meant sacrifice, that being a good woman meant being understanding, being patient, being forgiving. But no one told her what it would cost, to always be the one who holds everything together, even when she's falling apart inside. And so she kept choosing them and unchoosing herself, little by little, smile by forced smile, until she couldn't hear her own voice over the noise of being enough for someone else. Carl Jung wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent." But for her, the greatest burden became the unlived life of her own soul, a soul she kept pushing aside to keep relationships alive. She doesn't hate men. She just refuses now to twist herself into something softer just to be held, to make herself smaller just to be loved. So if she seems distant now, if her silence feels hard, if her solitude looks sharp, know this: it's not a wall, it's a boundary. It's not anger, it's clarity. She's not closing her heart. She's protecting what she spent years giving away too easily. She doesn't hate you, but she finally loves herself more than the fantasy of being chosen. And that changes everything. Number 3, the Jungian threshold. When the feminine withdraws into herself, there's a silence that doesn't come from pain, but from realization. The kind of silence that doesn't beg to be understood anymore, that doesn't reach out, doesn't chase, doesn't hope. It just settles, like water finding its stillness after the storm. That's the threshold she's crossed. Not a breakdown, not a collapse, but a return. Carl Jung called it individuation, the sacred and often terrifying process of becoming whole, not through someone else, but by withdrawing from the outer noise long enough to hear the whisper of one's own soul. When the feminine withdraws into herself, it's not rejection, it's remembrance, because somewhere in the chase for love, she forgot what it felt like to just belong to herself. She forgot the sound of her own instincts, the power of being full without being full of someone else. And most of all, she forgot that silence isn't always loneliness. Sometimes it's resurrection. She doesn't post about it. She doesn't announce her transformation. She just stops showing up for things that cost her peace. She stops performing care. She stops managing other people's emotions at the expense of her own nervous system. And slowly, she begins to hear something she hasn't heard in years. Her own voice, not the voice molded by expectation, not the one softened by fear, but the wild, ancient one, the one that knows when to leave, when to stay, when to roar, and when to rest. People may look at her and think she's isolating, but what they can't see is that she's no longer running on external validation. She's no longer addicted to being needed. She is no longer afraid of her own depth. She has stepped across a threshold, and once you cross it, you don't come back the same. Because once you've met yourself fully, you stop begging the world to do it for you. Number 4, from need to power, why she's no longer afraid to be alone. At first, the silence felt sharp. It echoed like absence, the kind of emptiness that makes you reach for anything, anyone just to fill it. She used to confuse that ache with loneliness, used to call heartbreak, but it wasn't. It was withdrawal, not from people, but from the performance. Because for so long, being loved meant being needed, being essential to someone else's story, being the safe place, the listener, the supporter, the one who always understood. And while that looked like closeness on the outside, on the inside, it felt like depletion. She didn't fear being alone. She feared no longer being useful. She feared not being wanted. But something shifted. There comes a moment when a woman no longer craves to be needed because she finally understands that what she gave wasn't love. It was survival. And now, survival no longer feels like enough. Carl Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." And that's where she is now, not dreaming of love, but awakening to her own. She wakes up and doesn't rush to check her phone. She walks alone and doesn't wonder who's watching. She makes tea at night without anyone to hold, and still feels held by herself. She no longer sees solitude as a threat. She sees it as a mirror, a sanctuary, a place where she remembers that her worth was never in how she served others. It was in how she finally learned to stay with herself when no one else could. And when a woman reaches that place, She stops choosing connection out of fear. She stops choosing presence out of panic. She waits, not because she's withholding, but because she knows now, if it doesn't nourish her soul, she would rather sit alone with silence than share space with someone who only knows how to touch her body but not her being. Number 5, the feminine that awakens when she stops explaining. There comes a moment when she stops explaining, not because she's given up, but because she finally understands. The more she explains, the more she disappears. She used to believe that if she could just say it right, if she could make her pain understandable, her needs more convenient, her emotions more digestible, then maybe someone would stay. So she translated herself over and over, softened her voice, held back the tears, smiled when her soul was aching, and called it love. But now she's quiet, not silent because she's defeated, but because she's done begging for clarity where there is none. She no longer fears being misunderstood. She fears losing herself to the performance of being agreeable. Carl Jung wrote, "A woman who has become conscious of herself becomes a force of nature." And this is that moment where she stops trying to make people feel safe inside her truth and simply lives it. She doesn't need you to agree. She doesn't need to be right. She doesn't even need to be seen. She only needs to remain loyal to her center. And in that center, a new kind of feminine awakens, not the version groomed to be palatable, not the version shaped by other people's desires, but the raw, radiant version, the one that doesn't apologize for being too quiet or too much, too sensitive or too still. She becomes magnetic without trying, not because she's performing, but because she's present. And the feminine that arises in presence, in rooted, grounded, unapologetic stillness, is not something you can capture or control. You don't chase her. You meet her, or you miss her, because the awakened woman no longer tries to convince you of her worth. She just becomes it, and lets her silence speak the rest. So no, she didn't walk away from love. She walked away from everything that asked her to betray herself in order to feel loved. She didn't choose solitude because she didn't want connection. She chose it because connection without truth felt lonelier than being alone. And once you felt that kind of loneliness, the kind that echoes inside a relationship, you begin to realize peace is not found in being understood. It's found in no longer needing to be. Carl Jung taught us that the soul is never truly lost, only buried beneath years of forgetting. And when a woman finally remembers who she was before the world asked her to be quiet, before she was told to be pleasing, soft, desirable, she becomes dangerous, not to others, but to the systems that fed on her self-abandonment, to the men who only knew how to love her fragments, but never her fullness. This is the woman who no longer explains. She no longer performs. She no longer waits. She simply is. And if that unsettles you, it's because you're still learning to meet someone who doesn't need your permission to be whole. So if this message stirred something in you, a memory, a wound, a knowing, leave a comment below. Say what you were never allowed to say, not for likes, but for liberation, like this video. Share it with someone still trapped in the performance of being lovable, and subscribe, because this space is not for pretending. It's for remembering. You don't have to chase love. You only have to come home to yourself and let the right ones meet you there. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next video.